How does paradise turn into a battlefield overnight? At dawn, on a windswept morning along Mexico's Highway 1, two massive white banners fluttered above the traffic near Los Cabos. Tourists on their way to the airport thought it was another festival, until they read the words. In blood-red paint, the Sinaloa cartel declared war on Americans. The message was unmistakable. If Washington doesn't stop, every American here becomes fair game. Within minutes, the illusion of safety in one of Mexico's most glamorous resorts shattered like glass under pressure. The U.S. Embassy issued urgent warnings. Hotels tightened security. Helicopters swept the coastline. For the first time, a Mexican cartel wasn't threatening rivals, it was threatening citizens of the United States. According to Reuters and BBC reports, the banners bore the insignia of La Chapiza, the armed wing loyal to El Chapo's sons, Los Chapitos. Their warning wasn't about drugs, it was about revenge. This marked an escalation unlike any before. Washington's crackdown on the Sinaloa cartel had hit home. 300,000 kilograms of Chinese chemical precursors seized in Houston, record-breaking raids in Sonora, and multi-billion-dollar money trails frozen by the U.S. Treasury. DW described it as a financial siege, a deliberate strategy to suffocate the cartel's empire before it could adapt. But no one expected the counter-move to target American lives on foreign soil. In the corridors of the Pentagon, analysts called it narco-terrorism, the transformation of a cartel from a criminal syndicate into a political aggressor. Defense news sources reported that the Pentagon quietly placed surveillance drones over Baja California to monitor movement along cartel-controlled routes, signaling a shift from law enforcement to military containment. The parallels with other global flashpoints were hard to ignore, like Russia's hybrid tactics in Ukraine or Iran's use of proxies across the Middle East. Mexico's cartels were using asymmetric warfare, psychological operations, digital propaganda, and terror by headline to manipulate Washington's response. The strategy mirrored the playbook of non-state actors worldwide: provoke, wait, then profit from chaos. For ordinary Americans living in Los Cabos, the fear was immediate and personal. Retirees abandoned beachfront homes, flight bookings plummeted. What was once a postcard of peace became a red zone evacuation map. "It feels like Beirut in the 80s, one US resident told The Guardian. "You can't tell where the war starts anymore." As dusk fell over the Pacific, the question loomed larger than the banners themselves. How far would the United States go to defend its citizens abroad when the enemy wasn't a nation, but a network? And if the battleground is now everywhere, where does America draw the line between justice and war? The cameras flashed. The question cut through the chaos. "Mr. President, would you really use nuclear weapons against a cartel?" Donald Trump looked straight into the lens and answered, "If they harm one American, they'll see what real power looks like." The press room fell silent. That sentence, carried live by Reuters and BBC World, became an instant global headline. Washington had drawn a red line in the sand, and it was radioactive. This was not bluster. In his second term, Trump's national security doctrine had redefined imminent threat to include transnational criminal networks capable of orchestrating mass casualty attacks. Pentagon lawyers, according to Defense News, argued that the president had constitutional authority under exigent circumstances to neutralize any imminent danger to American citizens. The idea of targeting a cartel with strategic deterrence, once unthinkable, now sat squarely on the table. Inside the Situation Room, the mood was tense. Intelligence briefings from DHS and DEA described La Chapiza's threats as credible, not symbolic. Encrypted messages intercepted by U.S. cyber units revealed discussions of kidnapping Americans and attacking tourist hubs. The FBI under Director Kash Patel coordinated emergency evacuation protocols. Trump's directive was clear: no more warnings, Act First. This escalation wasn't only about Mexico. It was about reclaiming deterrence, the very principle that had defined American power since the Cold War. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly drew chilling parallels between the cartel crisis and the broader geopolitical chessboard. Russia used disinformation, China used economic coercion, Iran used militias. Now, Mexico's cartels had entered the same arena of hybrid warfare. Decentralized, unpredictable, lethal. DW noted that in the Kremlin and Beijing, the message was received loud and clear. The US was ready to blur the line between counterterrorism and counter-narcotics. For allies in NATO, it was reassurance. For adversaries, a warning. Trump's America was reasserting its right to strike preemptively, even without international consensus. Meanwhile, Al Jazeera reported unease across Latin America. Governments feared the precedent. If Washington could label a cartel a strategic threat, what stopped it from treating other criminal networks the same way? Mexico's president tried to calm tensions, insisting there would be no war on Mexican soil. But privately, military officials admitted coordination with US drones had already begun. Beyond politics, the human dimension grew darker. American tourists stranded in Cabo San Lucas described beaches patrolled by masked gunmen. Families hid inside hotels as armored convoys rolled past. Airlines rerouted flights to avoid cartel-controlled corridors. This is not tourism anymore, one pilot told Reuters. This is an extraction zone. The world now watched the unthinkable unfold. A nuclear-armed superpower confronting an enemy without a capital, a flag, or borders. The question was no longer if Trump meant what he said, but whether the United States could contain the consequences of acting on that threat. How far can deterrence go before it becomes destruction? And when America's enemies no longer wear uniforms, how does the world recognize the beginning or the end of war? It began as a warning. It became a blueprint for war. Within hours of the Los Cabos threat, Trump authorized what insiders now call the Five-Front Directive, a coordinated offensive designed to cripple the Sinaloa cartel across every dimension of power: manufacturing, money, leadership, labs, borders. Each front was a calculated strike against the cartel's infrastructure, aimed to collapse it like a dying star. The first front, manufacturing. U.S. Navy intelligence satellites mapped supply routes from Shanghai to Mazatlan, where precursor chemicals arrived under falsified labels. Working with the Coast Guard, American operatives intercepted 6 steel containers carrying 300,000 kilograms of chemical solvents, enough to manufacture tons of methamphetamine. BBC News confirmed it was the largest maritime seizure in U.S. history. The message was unmistakable. America would strike not after the poison crossed the border, but before it was even mixed. The second front, money. The Treasury and FBI unleashed forensic accountants on a mission that looked more like counter-terror finance than narcotics policing. Defense News described it as a digital manhunt for the Sinaloa dollar. Agents followed wire transfers through shell companies in Panama, Singapore, and the UAE. The result? 7 corporate fronts sanctioned, 14 accounts frozen, and $1 billion vaporized from cartel liquidity. The third front, leadership. Joint U.S.-Mexican raids captured or neutralized 4 of Sinaloa's top lieutenants, including Joaquin Guzman Lopez and Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia. Jane's Defense Weekly reported the operations involved American surveillance aircraft inside Mexican airspace, a first in modern history. The arrests detonated chaos within Sinaloa, pitting Los Chapitos against the La Maíza faction in a bloody power struggle that fractured the cartel's command chain. The fourth front, labs. Drone footage released by the DEA showed convoys of armed trucks storming chemical super labs in Sonora and Sinaloa. Over 600 operatives were captured, hundreds of barrels destroyed, and production halted. One official described it as the industrial genocide of the cartel economy. And the final front, borders. The U.S. transformed its southern frontier into a living wall of surveillance. Drones, heat sensors, and AI-guided patrols swept the desert night. Coast Guard cutters prowled the Gulf, intercepting cartel submarines before they reached the Texas coast. This strategy, analysts say, mirrored the U.S. counterinsurgency model used in Afghanistan, but with one crucial difference. there would be no negotiations. DW drew parallels with Ukraine's recent multi-domain warfare, where simultaneous assaults cripple an opponent's logistics faster than they can regroup. Still, the cost of such escalation rippled globally. Al Jazeera warned that this offensive could push cartels into alliances with rogue states. Iran, for instance, had already supplied drones to Venezuela. China's silence on the seized chemicals raised alarms in Washington that Beijing might turn economic leverage into quiet retaliation. In the middle of it all, one question grew louder. Can a five-front war be fought without spilling over into something far bigger? Something no longer about drugs, but about dominance. Because when America opens 5 fronts at once, it's not just fighting criminals. It's redrawing the rules of global warfare. Behind every bullet and banner lay a darker battlefield, the economy. Trump's war on the Sinaloa cartel was no longer fought in jungles or streets, but through spreadsheets, sanctions, and seized assets. What Washington called financial warfare was a silent siege on the arteries that fed the cartel's empire. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, froze millions in cryptocurrency linked to offshore laundering networks in Singapore, Dubai, and Panama. According to Reuters, over 70 digital wallets connected to Sinaloa brokers vanished overnight. They woke up broke, one federal analyst told The Guardian. By weaponizing finance, Trump's administration had turned the global banking system into an extension of American firepower. Meanwhile, the supply chain offensive was redefining geopolitics. DW reported that U.S. Coast Guard operations off the Pacific coast had intercepted Chinese ships carrying vast quantities of precursor chemicals, the essential ingredients for fentanyl and meth. These seizures revealed not just a cartel network, but an industrial alliance spanning oceans. Beijing denied involvement, yet U.S. intelligence traced multiple exporters to companies already sanctioned for dual-use technologies. Defense News noted that American naval assets in the Indo-Pacific were quietly rerouted to monitor chemical shipments, mirroring operations once reserved for nuclear proliferation. The parallel was chilling. Synthetic drugs had become weapons of mass destabilization, with global actors profiting from the chaos. By mid-2025, Jane's Defense Weekly estimated cartel profits had plunged by nearly 60%. Shell firms collapsed, lab supplies dried up, and bribes once paid in gold now bounced in digital limbo. In response, Sinaloa's surviving factions resorted to old tactics: kidnappings, extortion, smuggling migrants. The empire that once rivaled mid-sized economies was bleeding from every vein. But this economic war had consequences far beyond Mexico. Like the sanctions campaign against Russia's war machine or the blockade on Iran's oil exports, Trump's crackdown created new fault lines. Latin American banks saw capital flight. Chinese shipping insurers demanded triple premiums for routes through the Gulf. Even Europe felt the tremors. The EU's anti-narcotics agency warned of synthetic famine as supply routes collapsed, triggering spikes in street prices from Berlin to Paris. Amid these shocks, Trump's advisors hailed the result as proof of deterrence. America could now destroy an empire without firing a shot. Yet Al Jazeera and The Guardian raised the same haunting question: at what cost? In Mexico, entire towns once dependent on cartel cash faced ruin. Jobless youth joined militias or fled north. Corrupt officials suddenly broke, turned against each other. The line between justice and collective punishment blurred. And as the US flexed its economic might abroad, China and Russia quietly studied the model. Could they use similar tactics, cyber blockades, currency manipulation, against Washington one day? Power, after all, is contagious. Trump's doctrine was reshaping not only the fight against drugs, but the global hierarchy of power itself. America was proving it could cripple its enemies without deploying armies. But if financial warfare replaced diplomacy, what remained of the world order built on law, not leverage? How long before the weapon that crushed cartels becomes the tool that turns against democracies themselves? When the financial siege tightened, the cartels struck back, not with tanks or missiles, but with fear. What began as death threats scrawled on white banners evolved into a digital and psychological war that reached deep into American life. They called it La Guerra de Sombras, the Shadow War. Within days of the US offensive, encrypted networks used by La Chapiza began spreading bounty lists. Reuters and BBC confirmed what many had dismissed as rumors. The names, faces, and home addresses of DEA agents and Homeland Security officers were circulating online. $2,000 to kidnap, $10,000 to kill. It was a chilling adaptation of the cartel's tactics. Terror, outsourced to the web. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem went on Fox News, her tone grave. "We're not just dealing with drug traffickers anymore," she said. "These are paramilitary networks with intelligence capabilities." DW reported that the US had quietly activated Operation Mirage, a counterintelligence mission to dismantle the digital wings of La Chapiza using cyber forensics and AI tracking. But retaliation wasn't confined to screens. Along the border, US agents were ambushed by gunmen using military-grade weapons, AK-103 rifles, and Chinese Type 56 machine guns. Jane's Defense Weekly traced the origins to smuggling networks tied to Iranian intermediaries, the same route supplying drones to Venezuela. Once again, the lines blurred. Where did organized crime end and geopolitical manipulation begin? Inside the Pentagon, intelligence officers warned that the pattern resembled hybrid conflicts seen in Ukraine and the Middle East. "They're not fighting for land," one defense news source explained. "They're fighting for perception." Each cartel attack, whether a bombing, a hacked database, or a leaked assassination list, was meant to show Washington's reach had limits. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans felt the echo of this unseen war. Families in Texas border towns began altering daily routines, driving different routes, checking under cars, avoiding public events. DEA agents lived under constant protection. Hotels across Los Cabos shut their doors to tourists. "This isn't a vacation city anymore," The Guardian quoted a former resident. "It's a waiting room for the next attack." And yet, for every threat, Washington struck back harder. ICE raids swept across Arizona and California, seizing safe houses. Coast Guard drones patrolled the Pacific night, scanning for submarines smuggling fentanyl barrels. Mexican intelligence joined in. Reluctantly at first, then decisively, as cartel violence spilled into their own cities. Still, beneath the power and retaliation, a darker truth emerged. Each strike hardened the resolve of the cartels, who now saw themselves as insurgents in a nationalist struggle, just as Hamas leveraged chaos to claim martyrdom, and Wagner's remnants sought revenge after their collapse. La Chapiza began painting itself as Mexico's defiant resistance. The narrative, toxic and potent, spread fast across social media. Experts warned that America was no longer fighting a cartel. It was fighting an ideology built on defiance, fear, and spectacle. And in that contest, bullets mattered less than belief. So, as Washington fortified its defenses and Mexico burned under curfews and raids, the world was left to wonder, if every victory only breeds the next rebellion, what does winning this war truly mean? By the end of 2025, the world's most powerful nation stood on the edge of redefining its longest war. What began as a cartel crackdown had transformed into a full-spectrum campaign, one that blurred every line between law enforcement, counterterrorism, and military engagement. In Washington, it was now called the Los Cabos Doctrine. Under this new policy, the United States could strike any non-state actor, anywhere, if that entity posed an imminent threat to American lives. The Guardian described it as the Bush Doctrine on steroids, while DW called it a turning point for Western law. The language was simple: deterrence through dominance. Yet the implications were vast. For decades, America's wars had been against regimes and armies. Now it was fighting shadows, cartels, hackers, and hybrid militias that operated across continents. The Reuters foreign desk noted that Trump's doctrine had already reshaped NATO's posture. US drones were now authorized for joint missions in the Caribbean. European allies quietly expanded intelligence sharing frameworks under the banner of counter-cartel operations. Meanwhile, Defense News reported that the Pentagon had tested a non-lethal precision deterrent, a low-yield electromagnetic pulse system designed to disable cartel infrastructure without civilian casualties. The world took notice. In Beijing, analysts warned that Washington's flexibility could justify future interventions in the South China Sea. In Moscow, propagandists compared Trump's Mexico campaign to Russia's own special military operations. And in Tehran, the regime saw opportunity, offering sanctuary and weapons to Latin American militias now eager for revenge. Still, supporters of the new strategy pointed to results. Cartel revenues plummeted by over 70%. Production networks fractured. Hundreds of fugitives were extradited. Los Cabos, once the heart of fear, began to rebuild under heavy US-Mexican patrols. For the first time in a generation, the border was no longer just a wall. It was a fortress of coordination. Yet, beneath the triumph lay tension. Civil liberties groups warned that the line between defending Americans and policing the world was fading fast. Al Jazeera reported on drone strikes allegedly conducted without Mexico's formal approval. Families displaced by raids accused both governments of collective punishment. And inside the United States, quiet unease grew. If presidents could launch preemptive wars without Congress, what stood between democracy and endless emergency powers? The parallels were haunting. Ukraine fought for sovereignty, Israel fought for security, the United States now fought for control of a war with no end. Each front mirrored the same paradox. Can freedom survive perpetual defense? In Los Cabos, the sea returned to calm. Tourists came back, but the soldiers stayed. Above the beaches, radar towers blinked under the sunset, a reminder that peace had been purchased at a heavy price. America had proven its power once again, but also revealed its vulnerability. In an age where enemies wear no uniforms, deterrence has no borders, and the cost of safety keeps climbing, the question remains: if America must threaten annihilation to feel secure, has victory already gone too far? The Los Cabos crisis began with 2 cartel banners, but evolved into a seismic test of American power under President Donald Trump. The Sinaloa cartel's threat to kill US citizens triggered a 5-front war that merged law enforcement precision with military might. From chemical seizures in China to cyber hunts across the Pacific, Washington waged total warfare: financial, digital, and physical. The campaign succeeded in crippling cartel networks, freezing billions, and restoring deterrence, but it also blurred the moral and legal boundaries of America's authority abroad. As the US exported its doctrine of dominance, allies applauded, adversaries adapted, and civilians paid the price. Like Ukraine's fight for sovereignty and Israel's endless security battles, the American war on cartels exposed the modern dilemma. Victory no longer guarantees peace. The question now echoing across borders is simple. If war without nations becomes the norm, what will remain of freedom